Israel, the land promised by God to the Jewish people 8,000 years ago. As Yom Kippur approaches, we invite you Gentiles to join the 2,800 slaves per Jew promised to us by the Talmud in Shabbat 32b verse 6, at least those of us who attach fringes to the corners of our garments. Even if you don't want to be numbered in the 2,800 slaves per Jew with fringes on their garments, we've got the only 522 slaves that matter in your government. As Senator Ted Cruz noted, those who bless Israel will be blessed by God, at least according to Ted's Sunday school teacher. As you reflect on the approaching Day of Atonement, and we Jews wave our sin chickened around in the air to atone for all the wrong we have done throughout the year, consider becoming that most oxymoronic of things, a Zionist Christian. Jesus, who we teach is boiling in shit in the Talmud, probably wishes he were a Zionist Christian. Before it's too late, submit to God's chosen people and be numbered with the 2,800 Gentile slaves per Jew with fringes on their garments, just like your elected officials and Ted Cruz's Sunday school teacher. Don't boil in shit in the depths of hell. Become a Zionist Christian today.
How about we all come together and say, let's stop attacking pedophiles?
I'm Ted Cruz, and I approve this message.
And there you have it. There you have it, folks. There you have it. There you have it. The best cold opening we've done in our short life as a live stream show. And so I just, wanted to throw that out there. We emphasized that last episode what the Talmud teaches about how when the Messiah comes, every Jew will have 2,800 of us as a slave. We emphasize that by presenting live footage of a guy on the street just going around and walking up to Orthodox Jews in Israel and asking them what the Talmud said in regards to that prophecy that each Jew would have 2,800 slaves after the return of the Messiah. And so we, as we've said repeatedly, if you want to beat a leftist at their own argument, all you have to do is use their own words against them. And if you want to beat somebody who's a racist at their own argument or an ethno-supremacist, all you have to do, use their own words against them. The Talmud is a gold mine. I highly encourage anyone watching this to go look it up online. It's Sefaria, Sefaria, Sefaria. They have the Talmud online, translated in English. And I'll commend them on this. Unlike a lot of other translations I've seen, they don't leave the objectionable stuff out or translate it down for the most part. They leave it in, as is. So all the greatest hits are there. And you can see for yourself exactly what the Talmud teaches about Jews, about girls who are 3 years old in one day. You can see all of that good stuff. And you can see exactly how satanic Talmudic Judaism truly is. And, of course, as we said in the cold open, they do teach that Jesus Christ is boiling in excrement in hell for blasphemy. But be that as it may, we want to move forward. We don't want this episode to be a rant about Jews. We want this episode to be focused on ritual abuse, Zionism, and the Franklin scandal of the 1980s that many of us are familiar with. And so without further ado, we're going to focus on, first off, recent developments in Israel involving Israeli women who came forward to testify at the Israeli Knesset or Parliament. That's their equivalent of Congress. to testify about the ritual abuse they suffered at the hands of extremely powerful businessmen, doctors, lawyers, politicians, prominent Israeli men, even rabbis. And one other thing that I noticed about this is just how strikingly similar it is to the allegations in the Hamlin case. In the Hamlin case, you had the concept of gatekeepers. David Lee Hamlin's daughters alleged that the LDS Church of Satan, at least the adults that they were familiar with, told them that they had gatekeepers positioned throughout Utah who could assist the group in intercepting any sort of exposure or any sort of compromising information that got out there. So if they went and they reported, well, the LDS Church of Satan supposedly had gatekeepers positioned throughout the establishment of Utah at the political and legal and cultural level, even the medical level, and that those individuals could get you committed for psychiatric reasons, and in doing so discredit you, that they would intercept any attempt to report their abuses and their criminal conduct to the police. These women are essentially saying the same thing in their allegations against prominent Israelis, that they claimed ritually abused them throughout the state of Israel over a number of decades. And so without further ado, let's take a look at that footage.
אני שומעת מנפגעות וגם בזיכרונות שלי על אנשים בכירים שהשתתפו בפגיעות טקסיות בכל רחבי הארץ, על רופאים, רבנים בכירים, אנשי משטרה, אנשי חינוך, וגם על כמה חברי כנסת מהעבר וגם כמה חברי כנסת מכהנים בהווה שלקחו חלק בפגיעות כאלה מקצוות שונים של הקשת הפוליטית. מובן מאליו.
כרגע שיש כמה חברי כנסת,
כן,
העבר וההווה.
היה סיפור שהתפרסם, אני יודעת על עוד כמה. מובן מאליו כי מול אנשים חזקים כל כך, ובפרט כשמדובר על פגיעות בלתי נתפסות, רוב הנפגעות אינן מעיזות לדבר, ולכן ברור לי שעשרות הנפגעות שהגיעו אליי הם טיפה בים של אלפי נפגעי פגיעה טקסית בישראל.
So let's talk about that footage and unpack what we just saw. Let's talk about the fact that these women are saying that there are several members of their government, their legislative body, the Knesset, both current and former, who participated in their ritual, sexual, physical, and mental abuse. It's essentially the same thing that the Hamlin sisters are saying occurred in Utah County and in San Pete County and in Juab County, as well as Salt Lake County. Those four counties in particular are named by the locations in those 8 victim statements. Now, those locations correspond to some very powerful and influential members of the church, ranking from stake presidents down to powerful businessmen. The brother of a former governor, that would be David Levitt, Mike Levitt's younger brother. And it is, in effect, something that you would recognize if you, like me, had spent the last 3 years of your life looking into allegations of ritual abuse in the state of Utah. Because what do we know about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and what it teaches about itself? It roughly analogizes itself to the tribe of Ephraim, to Israel. And it says that it began in part when the Nephites and the Lamanites came to the Americas from Israel. That's the origin story of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And what you see here in this footage is more of the same that you see in the Hamlin case and in other allegations of ritual abuse that I've looked at. Allegations which, by the way, implicate 13 of the top 15 current members of the church, of course, we're down to roughly 14 men because Russell M. Nelson, the prophet who didn't prophesy, is recently deceased at 101 years of age. Now, there are allegations that I've seen from, 30 years ago, 35 years ago, or longer, when he was already in his 60s, detailing how sadistic and violent he became when he became frustrated over his erectile dysfunction during episodes of ritualistic abuse with other members of the Quorum of the 12. That's who the current prophet, seer, and revelator of the church was, or the previous prophet, seer, and revelator of the church was, Russell M. Nelson, and his successor, Dallin Oaks, also has allegations of abuse against him. And to my knowledge, the only two members of the Quorum of the 12 who do not have multiple allegations of ritual abuse against them are Dieter Uchtdorf and Patrick Kieran. So I'm not saying that all of these men have allegations of ritual abuse against them. They don't. Patrick Kieran doesn't have any. Dieter Uchtdorf, as I said on a prior episode, had one. I didn't necessarily believe it, simply because it was extremely difficult to corroborate it, if not impossible. And then on top of it, the other side of it is that there weren't multiple allegations. In my experience in 25 years of doing this, it's never just one child victim of sexual abuse. It's multiple. So I see in the comments we have some complaints about the volume. It is getting low and fluctuating a little bit. I moved the meter over, so you should see me now try to stay closer to the mic. You know me, I'm not loud enough. Talk to my wife, she says otherwise. But in that clip that we just saw with the Israeli women at a press conference talking about their abuse at hands of members of the Israeli government and the Knesset, both former and present, what we see is something roughly analogous to what was said in the Hamlin victim statements. That these groups consist on some level of rich and powerful members of society, businessmen, doctors, lawyers, politicians, so on and so forth, influential people in culture, that is your intellectual elites, and those people participate in this kind of abuse. And the other thing that we're presenting here tonight is the allegations involving the Franklin Credit Union from the 1980s. And we have a couple of clips that we're going to examine here. The first one is going to be of a young lady named Alicia Owen, who came forward with allegations of abuse during the Nebraska congressional investigation into those allegations against Lawrence King, the president of the Omaha, Nebraska Franklin Credit Union. Mr. King later went to prison because it turned out he looted the Franklin Credit Union to the tune of millions of dollars. But the victims in that case testified that they were flown all over the country from Omaha and basically parceled out to rich and influential politicians and business leaders as part of a child sex trafficking ring. And the most notable individual that they were trafficked to was then Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush. And George Herbert Walker Bush had something of a checkered past anyway, because it wasn't the first allegation against him. Most people don't realize that when they read the Franklin conspiracy, or they read about the Franklin scandal in general, or they see the various documentaries that have been done to that effect, they don't realize what's going on in terms of his past and how when he was based out of Houston, Texas, there was a columnist who did attempt to report on George H.W. Bush's proclivity for young Latin male prostitutes, children, and how he had those prostitutes delivered to him at local motels throughout the Houston area. So this was not his first set of allegations against him. In the Franklin scandal, he was alleged to have shown favoritism towards a young African-American male named Brant, who was trafficked to him from Omaha to places like Chicago and elsewhere in D.C., and that was his preferred child prostitute, or his preferred child rape victim. He had a thing for Brant. And so without further ado, I'm going to cut off my mic briefly, and we're going to watch this clip of Alicia Owen from a documentary by, I believe, Pandora, that was done on the Franklin scandal.
When asked about satanic activity, Owen described a house in Leavenworth where a pentagram was painted on the kitchen floor. The home was filled with demonic pictures, and she mentioned a man named King's Horses who frequently attended the parties and oversaw King's dirty work. She claimed that King's Horses was deeply involved in occult ritual. Rusty Nelson and Lawrence King directed photography sessions at many of these parties, and Owen was forced to participate or receive physical beatings. She speculated that Nelson kept the negatives of these sessions to blackmail King. With the resulting testimony from his first witness, Caradori would recommend 62 individuals and documents to be subpoenaed, and he provided a list of alleged perpetrators, including Lawrence King, Police Chief Wadman, Harold Anderson, Alan Baer, Superintendent Deward Finch, Peter Citrone, and Judge Theodore Carlson.
And so let's unpack what we just saw in that clip. We saw a victim, Alicia Owens, testify to state investigators that there was an occult element to her abuse, that she was transported to a house that had occult symbolism throughout it, including a giant pentagram painted on the floor. And we see allegations that there was a man named Rusty Nelson who recorded the abuse, video and photographs. And this is very important because guess what Rusty Nelson would later attest to? He attested that he gave one of the investigators, a man named by the last name of Caradori, the negatives that depicted the abuse. And Caradori's plane crashed on his way back from Chicago, I believe it was. And so we're going to watch that clip here shortly.
Caradori met with Paul Bonacci on May 10, 1990, after getting his name from a member of the Concerned Parents Organization. Bonacci was in the Lincoln Correctional Center for 2 charges of sexual assault on a child. The victims were 13 and 9 years old. Bonacci was evaluated by a court-appointed psychiatrist and diagnosed with what was formerly known as multiple personality disorder, but what is now known as dissociative identity disorder. The disorder, while controversial in diagnostics, often presents in disorganized victims who suffer repeated and severe abuse as a child. Bonacci was born in Omaha, the second youngest of 6. He came from a broken home with a second and then third stepfather. He suffered neglect, and a predatory neighbor began abusing him at the age of 6. When he was 9 or 10, Bonacci became involved with drugs and sex work, loitering in a nearby park frequented by pedophiles. This quickly matured into parties where he encountered and embraced Satanism and large-scale exploitation. In the first 7 hours of videotaped interview, Bonacci confirmed he met Owen, Danny, and Troy in late 1983 at the Twin Towers apartments. He had already been abused by Citrone, Bear, and King. He described meeting Citrone at an amusement park, where he was solicited, and he described meeting Bear in 1979 in the Milk Run neighborhood. Bonacci was just 12 years old when he was abused by Bear and paid $20. He remembered that the encounters frequently included sadistic abuse, like beatings, cuttings, and burnings. Bonacci claims that his affiliation went on to include cross-country flights to California, D.C., and Des Moines, the same locations cited by the other witnesses. In one particularly brutal recounting, Bonacci claims a camera crew followed them to a remote area outside Sacramento. One of the boys was placed in a cage, and the other 2 were instructed to beat and abuse him. A particularly sadistic man joined the assault before shooting one of the boys with a handgun. The other 2 were instructed to continue their abuse afterwards. That night, Bonacci would unsuccessfully attempt suicide in the hotel bathroom, resulting in a 2-day stay in a California hospital. Bonacci confessed that he participated in the abduction of 12-year-old Johnny Gosch in Des Moines. It was the early morning of September 6, 1982, when Gosch vanished without a trace. The only remnants of his presence were a wagon with undelivered newspapers and his dog, left to wander the street alone. The search was immediate and widespread. Flyers were plastered on every surface, and the police were inundated with tips, entrenched in a case that defied explanation. The search quickly went cold. Months turned into years, and then in 1984, Johnny Gosch was one of the first missing children portrayed on a milk carton. This was an initiative to spark interest, drive public engagement, and unearth leads that might otherwise be lost. Bonacci recounted that men had forced him to kidnap Gosch. They threatened him with a pistol and instructed him to speak with the boy on the street long enough for one of the men to grab him. These men took Bonacci, Gosch, and another boy to a home near Omaha where their abuses were filmed. It was Bonacci's testimony that began to provide reason for the trips to Washington, D.C. He implied that King used children to blackmail politicians and other power brokers. The home in the area had been outfitted with security cameras to capture the illegal sexual activity. These tapes would be sold to other players to twist votes and force political capitulation. Bonacci claims that he was interviewed by the Omaha Police Department on several occasions. He even provided documentation of aggressors, including photographic evidence. However, nothing came from these investigations. Bonacci and Owen suggested that Caradori pursue Rusty Nelson, who likely had a surplus of photographic negatives. They could secure physical evidence of their testimony. On July 9, 1990, Caradori flew a 1984 single-engine Piper Saratoga from Lincoln to Chicago with his 8-year-old son. They were going to attend the MLB All-Star Game. Caradori told his wife that he would be meeting Rusty Nelson while in Chicago. Caradori made 4 phone calls while there, speaking with Lauren Schmidt, his wife, and 2 others. In one phone call, he stated that he would be acquiring photographs and other materials that would corroborate the testimony from his remaining 2 victims. Rusty Nelson would later confirm that he met with Caradori in Chicago and provided him with photographic negatives that would be the linchpin in the Franklin case. The All-Star Game ended around 11:45 p.m., and the Caradoris departed Chicago's Midway Airport at 1:51 a.m. An hour later, the plane crashed in a cornfield in Ashton, Illinois. Debris was scattered up to 1,800 feet from the fuselage, and an investigation determined that the plane had broken up mid-flight. 2 years later, it would be speculated that Caradori may have become overtaken by fatigue. When attempting to desperately recover lost altitude, he had snapped the wings off the plane. The backpack and film camera of Caradori's son were recovered nearly undamaged, yet Caradori's briefcase was not. Those close to the case believe that if Caradori had retrieved photographs, they would have been stored inside this briefcase. The following day, FBI agents armed with a subpoena arrived at Caradori's office, requiring the surrender of all evidence related to the Franklin case, as well as any phone logs and financial documents related to Caradori's investigations. Senator Schmidt feared that Caradori's death was one more example of corruption and cover-up. The committee hired former CIA Director William Colby to investigate the plane crash. During his tenure with the CIA, Colby notably devoted outsized resources to Operation Phoenix, which sought to disrupt the political and social support system of the Viet Cong by infiltration, assassination, torture, and more. The program resulted in over 25,000 deaths, many of whom were civilian non-combatants. Colby later became outspoken about the CIA's practices, and he received tremendous political and social pressure to keep his secrets. Colby, familiar with the pressures of political conspiracy, warned DeCamp and Schmidt about the forces at play. Colby investigated Caradori's plane crash and could not find evidence to indicate tampering with the plane. However, it's rumored that he told 3 members of the Franklin Committee that he believed Caradori had been assassinated. Mysteriously, Colby would take a solo canoe trip near his Maryland home in 1996, and he would go missing, only to be recovered 9 days later. There were no witnesses, and the scene was not thoroughly investigated, as authorities believed it was a stroke or accidental drowning. His life jacket was missing from his shed, but it was not recovered with his belongings.
And so there you have it, folks. You have corroboration from both Caradori's relatives and Rusty Nelson that photographic negatives of the abuse that would corroborate what Alicia Owen and others like Troy Broner had said, the allegations that they had made of sexual abuse, some of it ritual, against prominent Omaha businessmen and national politicians. Those photographic negatives were turned over to Frank Caradori. They were turned over by Rusty Nelson, who attested to that. Caradori told his family members before his fateful final flight that he had procured, or that he was going to procure those negatives, and his plane ended up in a field in pieces, and guess what was missing? His briefcase, which his friends and relatives and associates on the investigative committee the Nebraska legislature had chaired or had established to investigate the Franklin allegations. They all believed that those negatives would have been in that briefcase, and that briefcase was missing. So, again, this is what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a situation where you get so close, but not close enough to actually convict anybody, because the people involved in this are incredibly powerful, incredibly prominent, and incredibly entrenched within the political and economic and social establishment of whatever locality or whatever national scene that they're embedded in. And with Lawrence King, guess what? He's the guy who sang the national anthem at the Republican National Convention. And Mr. King had ties to another prominent Washington area individual by the name of Craig Spence, who was a lobbyist for the Japanese government, and who had enough pull at the White House to be able to take cowboys on a midnight trip of the White House during the Reagan administration. That was covered in the papers. And analogous to that is what you hear from other ritual abuse rings that reach the public eye. That those who engage in the abuse are powerful people within the political, financial, business, cultural establishment of whatever country they're in, whatever locality they reside, and they ultimately, despite overwhelming allegations against them in terms of like the quantity of allegations, and even in some cases the evidence against them, those allegations never get prosecuted. And the people who are bringing those allegations end up dead, discredited. The investigators who are trying to unearth evidence and trying to either corroborate or dispel the allegations wind up physically ruined or dead. That's the pattern that plays out when it comes to ritual abuse over and over and over again. And so without further ado, let's take a little break here, and let's talk about our sponsor, Great Value, Toasted Coconut. Thank you to the Walton family for sponsoring this podcast, this live stream, IRA Livestream 107, Christian Zionism, ritual abuse and the Franklin scandal, by providing absolutely zero funding to me to offset the considerable labor that I exert on these live streams, getting all of these clips together, everything else. You too could be a sponsor of IRA's live streams if you have a business or an interest that you'd like to advertise. We've got a whopping 6 people watching right now. Yeah, it's a broad audience, and it's growing. Of course, that audience stretches into the hundreds, people who watch it after it's gone live. And, you know, we do good work here. We do extremely good work here at IRA. And thanks to the Walton family, the Silver Spoon crew that was born on third base and thinks they hit a triple, for sponsoring us with Great Value Toasted Coconut. It's delicious if you haven't had a chance to eat it. So that's our commercial plug for Great Value Toasted Coconut, cashews, and the Walton family. And so without further ado, let's get right back into Israel. And let's talk about the daughter of a prominent Israeli minister by the name, or the last name of Strouk. And let's talk about what she had to say. So we've examined the testimony of Israeli women who went before the Knesset and alleged that both former and current members of the Knesset were involved in their ritual abuse. We've looked at the allegations made by Paul Benassi. It should be Benacci, but he pronounced it Benassi. We've looked at the death of Frank Caradori. We've looked at Russie Nelson's corroborating testimony that he turned over photographic negatives of the abuse, evidence of the criminal abuse that was perpetrated against Alicia Owens and others in the Franklin credit union sex ring. And we've talked about how Frank Caradori's plane wound up in a field after it crashed, and his briefcase was magically missing. So here we go. We're going to pull up the live testimony or the live video that this Israeli minister by the last name of Strouk, her daughter, brought these allegations forward, alleging that her mother and father and at least one of her brothers participated in her sexual abuse. Some of it was ritualistic. And so let's take a look at this footage.
קוראים לי שושנה סטרוק. אני עברתי פגיעה מינית בילדות. זה אומר שזה בעצם שימש לפורנוגרפיית ילדים. אנחנו בעצם משטרת ישראל שתגן עליי גם מול הגורמים העבריינים האלה וגם מול המשפחה שלי.
And so there you have it, folks. We have a member of a hard right, no pun intended, political group in Israel, Orit Struk, her daughter accusing her husband, and at least one of her brothers of being a participant in their sexual abuse, or in her sexual abuse, up to and including the production of child pornography, which was distributed throughout Israel and possibly elsewhere. And she went live on social media with those allegations. She has since filed a sexual harassment complaint in Italy, where she apparently resides, having fled abroad from her alleged abusers, her mother Orit Struk, her father, and one of her brothers. Now, it's interesting that in the context of the Struk family, her brother was convicted, along with other perpetrators, of physically beating a Palestinian teenager almost to death. Apparently, this group of Zionist Israelis came across a Palestinian teenager with a baby goat. And that teenager was walking. He wasn't bothering them. He wasn't engaged in any kind of activity whatsoever that would warrant what these young men did to him. And they proceeded to beat him to the point where he had to be hospitalized. He almost died. The baby goat that he was carrying was kicked to death by Zavik Struk, Orit Struk's son, and her daughter's brother, obviously. It is unclear if he is the brother that was implicated as the sexual abuser of Shoshana Struk. Be that as it may, there is a history in that family that is indicative of something being deeply, deeply wrong. But then again, there's a history in the state of Israel of something being deeply, deeply wrong when right-wing, hardline political parties justify the rape of Palestinian prisoners by soldiers in the IDF and by their guards. So when those soldiers and guards were facing prosecution, members of the Israeli public who are Zionist protested on behalf of the soldiers and defended what they saw as their right to rape Palestinian prisoners. That's the level of what we're dealing with in the state of Israel. And as I've said on prior streams, you cannot separate that out from the Talmudic sexual norms articulated in various sections of the Talmud, which say things like you can be betrothed sexually or bisexual intercourse to a girl who is 3 years and 1 day old. And if you have sex with a girl younger than that, it's like putting a finger in the eye. That's the exact words in the Niddah section of the Talmud. If you look at the Israeli attitude towards Gentiles, which, as we said in Shabbat, I believe 37b, verse 6, earlier in this stream, it is that when the Messiah comes, They believe that Jesus was not the Messiah. So a future Messiah, when they come, each Jew will have 2,800 Gentile slaves who will do all of the physical labor. Now, we played that clip of Orthodox Jews in Israel talking about the return of the Messiah and these 2,800 slaves that they would have in a prior episode, like I believe IRA episode 106, just to give you an idea of what exactly the cultural norms are in the state of Israel. In that context, it makes total sense that these people would be okay with sexual abuse, whether it's ritualized or non-ritualized. There's something deeply wrong with their norms and their moral standards, obviously. And so one of the reasons this kind of abuse occurs, both towards Palestinians and towards Israelis, is because of the dehumanizing effect of the ideology on the Israeli public that Zionism has and that Talmudic Judaism has. And so without further ado, I want to play that clip of those women talking about their abuse at the hands of current and former members of the Israeli Knesset, that is their parliament of their Congress, earlier this year. And this is something they testified at legislative hearings about. And they said that doctors, lawyers, prominent members of both sides of the Israeli political spectrum were guilty of participating in their ritual sexual abuse, and had been doing so for a number of decades. So without further ado, let's pull that clip up again and let's show that clip to the people who are late to this stream.
אני שומעת מנפגעות וגם בזיכרונות שלי על אנשים בכירים שהשתתפו בפגיעות טקסיות בכל רחבי הארץ, על רופאים, רבנים בכירים, אנשי משטרה, אנשי חינוך, וגם על כמה חברי כנסת מהעבר וגם כמה חברי כנסת מכהנים בהווה שלקחו חלק בפגיעות כאלה מקצוות שונים של הקשת הפוליטית. מובן מאליו.
כרגע שיש כמה חברי כנסת,
כן,
העבר וההווה.
היה סיפור שהתפרסם, אני יודעת על עוד כמה. מובן מאליו כי מול אנשים חזקים כל כך, ובפרט כשמדובר על פגיעות בלתי נתפסות, רוב הנפגעות אינן מעיזות לדבר, ולכן ברור לי שעשרות הנפגעות שהגיעו אליי הם טיפה בים של אלפי נפגעי פגיעה טקסית בישראל.
So the phrase that they use is they're a drop in the ocean of the thousands of victims of this type of abuse at the hands of members of the Israeli Knesset and members of the establishment in Israel. So what we know about sexual abuse in general is that somewhere in the order of 20 to 22% of victims actually report their abuse. So if you extrapolate that out from the known numbers of those who report their sexual abuse, you're talking, as these women said, tens of thousands, if not more, victims who are silent, who don't come forward, and why should they? In the state of Utah, where the Hamlin case largely occurred, you have a 2.97% conviction rate for rape. That is, for every 100 cases of rape that are reported, less than 3 of the alleged rapists are ever convicted of a crime. Now, less than 13, or less than 12 actually, are prosecuted. They have a prosecution rate of under 12%. So that means that if you are someone who rapes an individual in Utah, you have a better than 88% chance of not being prosecuted for it. You have a better than 97 in 100 chance, 97% chance of never being convicted. And Utah is always consistently in the top 10 annually of states for rape reports. In terms of sexual abuse reports, it is number 1 or number 2, depending on the year. Utah leads the country in sexual and physical abuse against children. And that's just the reports that are made. There are many reports where the victims do not come forward. And that's what we're battling against in this state. It should be that way in a state that is overwhelmingly dominated by Latter-day Saints who at least publicly profess that they adhere to the law of chastity. But it is. And I can tell you that in the state of Utah, Latter-day Saints are not serious about the law of chastity. It's one of the reasons I left the church after I moved here, is because violations of sexual fidelity are rampant in this state. And you see it at all levels. You see it, J. Stewart Adams, the Utah Senate president, his 18-year-old step-granddaughter had sex with a 13-year-old boy. And he had the law changed so that she would be able to receive a lesser sentence. Now, the law that was changed did not apply to her retroactively, at least not on paper, but in reality it did apply retroactively because the judge in her sentencing cited the recent changes to the law that were advanced in part due to J. Stewart Adams' behind-the-scenes advocacy and lobbying on her part. And so J. Stewart Adams and others within the Utah Senate made a decision that an 18-year-old who raped a 13-year-old, and that's what it is, 13-year-olds can't consent, that 18-year-old would be subject to a lesser sentencing. I believe what Adams' granddaughter ultimately pled guilty to was aggravated assault, which is not what she did. That's not the crime she committed. She committed child rape under the statute that was in force at the time, but she was allowed to plead to aggravated assault. She was allowed to avoid registering as a sex offender. And what I would say to anybody out there watching, I don't believe that this happened in a vacuum. If, in fact, you know of other victims of Abigail Ross, that is J. Stewart Adams' step-granddaughter, I'd like to talk to those victims and their parents here at Investigations of Ritual Abuse. I'd like to shine a light on how political connections, not only in Israel, but in Utah, exempt certain groups of people, or people from certain classes, from culpability for sexually abusing children and adults. And so if you have a perpetrator within the Utah legislature, within the hierarchy of the church who has abused you, I'd like to speak to you. And you can email me at goel@investigationsandritualabuse.com. So, we've looked at the allegations in the Franklin credit union scandal and how those were corroborated. There was photographic evidence, according to multiple people, not just victims, but the man who took the photographs himself, Rusty Nelson, who says that he turned it over to an investigator from the Nebraska Legislative Committee that was looking into the allegations around the Franklin Credit Union. That investigator, Frank Caradori, wound up dying in a field when his plane crashed, and his briefcase went missing. And as we saw in that earlier clip, guess what happened? The FBI showed up to his offices and his residence and demanded all of the evidence that he had accumulated over the course of his investigation. In the state of Utah, I am aware that there is an inter-office memorandum, and I've had multiple law enforcement professionals at the federal level tell me about the existence of this memorandum, where the FBI in Salt Lake has a policy that they have articulated, they put into writing, in which they stated that ritual abuse is real in the state of Utah, that it is occurring. And the reason they don't prosecute it is because the victims do not make good witnesses. Well, in my experience, some of these victims would make excellent witnesses, and they have evidence of their abuse. But law enforcement, as a matter of policy, refuses to investigate the allegation. The prosecuting agencies, the county attorneys, and the U.S. Attorney's Office for various districts in and around Utah refuse to prosecute these allegations. If you mention ritual abuse at all in the context of sexual abuse, ultimately what happens is these agencies and these law enforcement professionals decide that they're just not going to investigate or prosecute your allegations to the full extent of the law, even no matter what evidence you have, no matter how credible you are. And that is another thing that we're working to change. The attitude. If you work within the federal law enforcement apparatus in the state of Utah at agencies such as Homeland Security's investigations, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the U.S. Marshals, I'd like to speak with you. And again, you can reach me at goel@investigationsandritualabuse.com. I have been trying to obtain a copy of that interoffice memo within the FBI in Utah that says that their policy is not to investigate or prosecute allegations of ritual abuse. If you have access to that memorandum, I'd like to see it. I'd like a copy of it. Again, you can reach me at goel@investigationsandritualabuse.com. And so, in closing tonight, what I would say to you is we look at these allegations and we look at the fact that Utah as a state and as a culture models itself after Israel, often refers to itself, or the religious elements of the state often refer to themselves as members of the lost tribe of Ephraim. They either say it explicitly or they analogize themselves to it. In many respects, Utah is kind of a pale imitation of Israel. And there's a surprising number of saints who are Zionist with respect to the state of Israel, but also with respect to kind of live-action role-playing as Jews. And so one of the things that they do is they adapt the Talmud and the Zohar. That is, the Zohar being the basis for Jewish mysticism as contained in the Kabbalah, which is absolute heresy. By the way, it's absolutely blasphemous. We will be getting into that in a future live stream and a future episode of IRA. But there are Mormons, Latter-day Saints, who are deeply steeped in this, who are adapting it to their lives and who believe that they are Jewish, if not ethnically, then by virtue of their connection to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its origin story, with the Nephites and the Lamanites being expatriate Jews who arrived in the Americas after their forefathers were told to depart from Israel and come to the Americas. They then split into two competing branches, the Nephites and the Lamanites, so named eponymously. This is what we're up against. We're up against a value system that has been adapted by certain Latter-day Saints who have just gone off the reservation. And they have adapted those same sexual norms and mores that I have criticized at length on these streams. The Talmudic idea that you can be betrothed by intercourse to a girl who is 3 years and 1 day old, and that raping a child under that age a child who's 2 years of age, is, according to the Talmud, akin to putting your thumb or your finger in someone's eye. That's just absolutely barbaric. It has no place in the 21st century. And the other side of it is with the Mormon cosmology, especially the parts of it that are from Brigham Young. What Brigham taught was that Jesus was not the product of a virgin birth. He stood at General Conference and he talked about Jesus being conceived by literal physical intercourse between Heavenly Father and the Virgin Mary. And that was how he taught that Jesus Christ came to be conceived, which, if it is true, would mean that Jesus Christ was not the Messiah foretold of in Isaiah 7:14, because he wasn't born of a virgin, and therefore he would not qualify. So Brigham Young's position is blasphemous. It's unscriptural. It's also incestuous, because what Latter-day Saints believe is that we are all the spirit children of Heavenly Father. So if Heavenly Father came down to earth and had sex with Mary, he was, in effect, having sex with his own daughter to conceive Jesus Christ. This is not a fact that has gone lost on Mormon sexual abusers, because I have spoken to law enforcement professionals in the state of Utah and elsewhere who repeatedly encountered this rationalization in their investigations from Mormon fathers who were being investigated for incestuous sexual abuse against their daughters. They cited Brigham Young's teaching as it pertained to Heavenly Father and Mary and the conception of Christ to justify and normalize what they were doing with their daughters. Again, this is the level of what you encounter. And I was tipped off by a source to that, and over time, I was able to cultivate sources within Arizona and elsewhere who said that alleged perpetrators, were appealing to that teaching of Brigham Young at a general conference to justify what they were doing to their daughters, because the purpose of the Mormon path is exaltation. It is ultimately to become a god. They teach, or at least Brigham Young taught, that Heavenly Father was once a man, and that he progressed through exaltation to become Heavenly Father, which is a tremendous break from Orthodox Christianity, which teaches that God was pre-existent to creation, that he was always God. It's always been Christian doctrine. And so the innovation that Brigham Young introduced is something that has been the direct basis and foundation of ritual abuse in Mormon communities in states like Arizona, Utah, Nevada, Idaho, basically the West Coast states of California, Oregon, and Washington. And these were not teachings that were canon at the time of Joseph Smith. They're not even canonical teachings now. In fact, Bruce R. McConkie rejected the Adam God doctrine and the doctrine that Christ was the product of a physical intercourse between Heavenly Father and his daughter Mary. These were explicitly and expressly condemned by the church. In fact, ongoing polygamy within and without the church has been condemned by various church presidents. And one of the things that also occurred under Brigham was that he taught that since there were a limited number of Latter-day Saints, they might have to marry their siblings in order to keep marriage between Latter-day Saints a reality. That's exactly what's going on in these offshoot groups today, such as the Kingston Group and the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints under Warren Jeffs and his successors, his accomplices. You see young girls being forced to marry at least their half-siblings, and you see allegations of abuse between full-blood siblings, because the boys are taught to exercise dominion over the girls. The fathers are sexually abusing their daughters in these fundamentalist groups. And so when we look at the allegation made by Shoshana Strouk against her mother, Rita Strouk, and at least one of her brothers and her father, it's strikingly similar to what was going on in the Hamlin case. David Lee Hamlin's daughters alleged that they were prostituted by their parents, trafficked to other members of the group, and people within the wider church. They also alleged that their parents, along with LDS filmmakers such as Brian Kappener, produced child pornography. They explicitly outline that in their victim statements. And in 2013, in a pretext call recorded by the Provo Police Department, David Lee Hamlin apologized to his daughter, Catherine, for raping her. In a recent live stream, which we covered on an earlier episode, David Lee Hamlin acknowledged that he had sex with his patients while he was a clinical psychologist as part of their therapy, and then he lost his license over it. But the way that he described it was, it worked for some of those patients and not others. So this is a man who was still clinging to the notion that on some level, because according to him, it worked for some of those patients, it wasn't entirely inappropriate. And yet, on three separate occasions actually, law enforcement and the prosecution in Utah County were unable to convict David Lee Hamlin. In the second prosecution against him for his abuse of Emily Sheets had corroborating eyewitnesses who were there and who were part of the abuse, Hamlin's daughters were in the room when the abuse was occurring, and they were victims of it. And so she had corroboration for at least one of those instances of abuse. And then, of course, there's a mountain of evidence from Hamlin's earlier criminal prosecution and the fact that a court in his divorce in 2003 found by clear and convincing evidence that he had, in fact, raped his daughters. At least two of them. He had sexually abused Rachel and Eliza, according to a court in 2003. And then there's the substantiated finding of sexual abuse by DCFS in 2000 and 2001 for the allegations made by Eliza Hamlin against her father. Despite all of this, David Lee Hamlin has never been convicted of any crime. Let that sink in. Let that sink in against the backdrop of a 2.97% conviction rate for rape in the state of Utah. That includes child rape. And an 11.97% prosecution rate in the state of Utah. Which basically means that if you rape someone 88 times out of 100, you're not going to face even so much as a prosecution for it. And even if you do, 97 times out of 100, you're not going to be convicted. So I'd like to close tonight by playing a message from the Adams-Wheeler campaign of 2028. It's their campaign ad, which I generously assisted them in producing because, I do kind things for my enemies. And so J. Stewart Adams is the individual, the president of the Utah State Senate, whose daughter Abigail Ross had sex with a 13-year-old boy and got no jail time as a result of it. Was not forced to register as a sex offender, even though what she did under the existing statute was child rape. She was allowed to plead to aggravated sexual abuse and avoid registering as a sex offender. And Todd Wheeler is the man who wanted to reduce the time on the sex offender registry for people who are guilty of sex trafficking, among other sex offenses, because he did not feel that they should be lifetime registrars for sex offenses, because he didn't feel that it should be a, quote, life sentence. And so these two men have tentatively announced that they are running for governor in 2028 to succeed Spencer Cox, a closeted gay man who has his own sordid history of alleged sexual abuse, which we will be exploring. And again, if you have been subjected to sexual abuse by Spencer Cox, and I have reason to believe that there are multiple victims out there, I'd like to talk to you at Goel at investigationsinritualabuse.com. Without further ado, Adams Wheeler, 2028. See if we can get it to pull up. Hold on a second. Be patient, folks. We're going to have all of this going here in a sec. Having a little bit of a technical difficulty here, but we'll move this over in the corner.
Utah minor attracted persons and adult attracted minors. Our liberties are under attack, and in these trying times, it is vital that we stand with those who have stood with us. That's why we at Maps for Utah are standing with Stuart Adams and Todd Weiler in their campaign for Utah governor and lieutenant governor in 2028. It's never too early to get behind the men who got behind us. Todd Weiler understood that child sex trafficking shouldn't be an offense that would result in a lifetime on the sex offender registry. He courageously sponsored legislation to shorten that time to just 10 years as a first step. Stuart Adams effectively lowered the age of consent to just 13 years old when his granddaughter Abigail Marie Ross was facing child rape charges for having sex with a 13-year-old twice. Our heritage and traditions are under attack in Utah, and our founders knew from their priesthood wisdom that a 13-year-old girl ought to be able to marry a 50-year-old man if she was in love with him, because love always wins. In 2028, vote Adams and Weiler for governor and lieutenant governor, and restore Utah's heritage and liberty for minor attracted persons and adult attracted minors. Paid for by Maps for Utah. I'm Abigail Marie Ross, and I approve this message.
And so, folks, that is IRA Livestream 107, is we celebrate our heritage here in the state of Deseret, where adult attracted minors and minor attracted persons will hopefully one day be able to get together and realize their love, thanks to the efforts of men like Todd Weiler and J. Stuart Adams, both of whom figure prominently in the Utah State Senate. Again, this is Goel, and this has been IRA Livestream episode 107 on ritual abuse, Zionism, and the Franklin scandal. Tune in next time as we continue to unpack the scourge of ritual abuse in the state of Utah. In closing, let's take one more look at that cold opening for this episode, and that'll be our outro for tonight's episode 107, IRA's live stream. That would be Ritual Abuse, Zionism, and the Franklin Scandal.
Israel, the land promised by God to the Jewish people 8,000 years ago. As Yom Kippur approaches, we invite you Gentiles to join the 2,800 slaves per Jew promised to us by the Talmud in Shabbat 32b verse 6, at least those of us who attach fringes to the corners of our garments. Even if you don't want to be numbered in the 2,800 slaves per Jew with fringes on their garments, we've got the only 522 slaves that matter in your government. As Senator Ted Cruz noted, those who bless Israel will be blessed by God, at least according to Ted's Sunday school teacher. As you reflect on the approaching Day of Atonement, and we Jews wave our sin chickened around in the air to atone for all the wrong we have done throughout the year, consider becoming that most oxymoronic of things, a Zionist Christian. Jesus, who we teach is boiling in shit in the Talmud, probably wishes he were a Zionist Christian. Before it's too late, submit to God's chosen people and be numbered with the 2,800 Gentile slaves per Jew with fringes on their garments, just like your elected officials and Ted Cruz's Sunday school teacher. Don't boil in shit in the depths of hell. Become a Zionist Christian today.
How about we all come together and say, let's stop attacking pedophiles?
I'm Ted Cruz, and I approve this message.
And so in closing, let's all get together, stop ganging up on and attacking pedophiles. Ted Cruz, never forget, folks. This has been IRA Livestream 107. I am your host, Goel. You can reach me at Goel at investigationsandritualabuse.com. You can follow the Substack, subscribe to it, Investigations and Ritual Abuse, over on Substack. That would be 1830goel.substack.com with an https :/ in front of that, 1830goel.substack.com, in which I primarily cover the allegations in the Hamlin case. Thanks for watching as always, and we will see you next time on IRA.